Hi, I'm Erin Parkes. I'm the founder and executive director of the Lotus Center for Special Music Education, which is a charitable organization based in Ottawa, Canada, with a mandate to provide access to adaptive music education for the neurodivergent and disability communities. I'm also an adjunct professor in the School of Music at the University of Ottawa. And today I'm going to talk about developing inclusive teams, balancing the voices of experts with people with lived experience. And I'm just going to preface all of this by saying that a lot of this is based on research or guidance that exists, but a lot of it is just also to open a conversation, ask some questions, because there's still a lot of work to do in this area. Before we get into the presentation, I just want to talk about my own position in this. I am neurodivergent, and I'm also the caregiver of 3 neurodivergent children. So that sort of makes up my lived experience piece. I'm also a researcher and a practitioner. So I conduct research on best practices in adaptive music education and the impacts of adaptive music education on the community. And I'm also a practitioner in my work at Lotus Center, developing, implementing, guiding, overseeing lots of different music programs for people with disabilities or neurodivergent people. And so I'm both an expert and a person with lived experience. And I would say that my lived experience has certainly driven my research and practitioner work, but I do consider it to be separate from it. Now, we'll talk a little bit later about, is that really happening? But that is my general perspective. So today we're going to cover the current state of practice that's happening with incorporating people with lived experience and some recommendations. We're also going to talk about some research on the pros and cons that have been noted by researchers and people with lived experience. And just a note here too, that when I say researchers, I always mean researchers and practitioners, or research and program projects. We're going to talk about some of the potential challenges and important considerations. And finally, we're going to talk about my perspective as both neurodivergent and an expert. So first, let's talk about what's happening in current practice. So many hospitals, health associations, and funders, particularly in the health sciences, really expect the participation of people with lived experience and in their process. So often there are guidance and mandates that require a certain level of participation at least, or projects just can't move forward. The expectation is less typical in arts funding or an arts organization, unless it's a really specific part of their mandate. So for example, when Lotus Center applies for grants or funding, it's always disability related. So there often it is a specific part of the mandate. So they are asking that people with lived experience are involved in the process. Now, what that means is quite opaque and often very unspecific. So usually they just ask, are there people in leadership who have lived experience, or people on your board of directors with lived experience? And leave it at that. And their involvement in the process or in the programming is not really a part of the conversation. And even in hospitals and health associations and healthcare work, the level of involvement is typically unclear. And there are varying levels of involvement. And when we get into the recommendations, we'll talk more about what that means. So often there's an advisory committee. This is sort of what we see most commonly. So there's a group of people with lived experience that are brought in to provide their opinions and feedback basically on the project. Most often this happens at the very early stages. So even before the project is starting, they give their feedback on whatever questions the researchers or practitioners might have on how they can enhance or make sure that they're delivering their project in a way that is respectful of the community. And a lot of times with advisory committees, they're just involved at the beginning and then they're not involved at all. So they give their opinions, but then they're not really a part of the process. And the researchers or practitioners kind of decide if they're going to take that information or leave it. Sort of the gold standard for involvement of people with lived experience is to be co-researchers, which means they would really be involved in all parts of the project. So from the beginning, deciding on what the research questions would be, what sort of research methodology is going to be involved, data collection tools, being often even included as co-authors or co-presenters at the end with the knowledge mobilization piece. And same thing when we're talking about practice projects, being involved in the development of the project. What is it going to look like? What's going to be feasible for people in their community? Should it be 6 weeks or 6 months? All of those questions, and then involved in the implementation, either as leaders or being present at all of the program elements to give their feedback, and then also as assessment at the end. There's also often the involvement of people with lived experience as staff members that is encouraged. So they're actually paid to implement these projects or be part of them. And also often we see people with lived experience involved in program assessment. The most often this just looks like surveys or questionnaires at the end of the project to see what the experience was of the people that were involved throughout. So now let's talk about some recommendations for the successful inclusion of people with lived experience. Then this is basically related to some of the guidance that's given, again, mostly by healthcare, but also in some reports and manuals by different organizations. A little bit based on research, though there is scant research on this topic. So there's not a lot coming from the research, but some is there. Most is just guidance, white papers, reports. So mutual respect is really key, with both parties recognizing the contributions of the other, with it not being set up that the experts are just eliciting the opinions of the people with lived experience, but that they're both seen as equal partners, having equal parts and equal contributions here. The people with lived experience should be involved in determining what their role needs to be for meaningful participation. Again, too often this is decided by the experts. They say, we need an advisory committee, or we need someone to help with the assessment. And they are determining how important the role of the person with lived experience should be. People with lived experience really should be consulted at the beginning. Part of their input should be, how involved do they need to be to make sure that this project represents their community and is respectful of their community? We also should allow the people with lived experience to guide the research questions. Now, we see this, hopefully, when they're really involved in co-research. But too often we don't. The experts decide what they're going to do, and then they bring the people with lived experience in to just double check everything, basically, and make sure what they're doing is okay. But really, the research or the projects, the programs, are there to benefit the target community. Shouldn't they be involved in deciding what needs to happen to benefit their community, and then working with the practitioners to make sure that that happens? The UK's National Institute for Health Research provides 5 principles for co-research, and this is based on their own research. The sharing of power is really important, and we'll talk about that a little bit more moving forward. Including all perspectives and skills, respecting and valuing the knowledge of all of those working together on the research, true reciprocity, and building and maintaining relationships. And this is a big piece. You can't really have respect without having a relationship based on reciprocity. And this means that sometimes there may need to be some awkward conversations to make sure that everybody is feeling comfortable. And these conversations need to go both ways. It shouldn't just be the experts asking things of the people with lived experience, but also the people with lived experience asking things of the researchers and working together in that way. There has been some research on how both the experts and the people with lived experience have felt during these projects where they've worked together. So here are some of the benefits and challenges that have been cited by the experts. So benefits have been an advanced level of insight, which is exactly what most are looking for. They feel that they understand the community better and are more informed on how to implement their project. They also felt that it's a two-way learning opportunity. So they have learned from the people with lived experience, but also that the people with lived experience have learned from them. Some of the challenges. This first one is one that has been brought up in, I think, every piece of literature that I've read on this topic, the fear of tokenism. So the experts worry that it's going to be perceived as tokenism. It's important to point out here that it's not tokenism if the people with lived experience are taken seriously and treated with respect and given power in this process. So I think that part of what is needed here is some education for the experts on what is tokenism, what is not tokenism. If there's meaningful engagement and sharing of power, it's not tokenism, and how they can do that. There are also concerns about facilitating reimbursement for the participants, but mostly also knowing what is appropriate. Very often, if we have advisory committees, people might be paid an honorarium or something like that. But what do we do if we're engaged in co-research, or if we truly want the people with lived experience to be involved from the beginning to the end? Acknowledging their contribution with appropriate reimbursement is really important, but there doesn't seem to be any consensus on what that looks like. So that's still a bit of an open question. Unfortunately, it was cited as a challenge by some of the experts that they did have some resistance to sharing power. They're used to coming in and making all the decisions about what their project is going to look like. And it was a little bit difficult for them to accept that maybe they made the initial decisions and sort of laid out the groundwork, but they need to listen to what the people with lived experience are saying. And if they're saying things need to go in a different direction, then for true inclusion, it should then go in a different direction. That's not to say that it can't be negotiated. Certainly, experts bring expertise. So they have a big contribution here, but it needs to work both ways. Experts often cited some concern about fear of re-traumatization for the people with lived experience. So if they're talking about events that may have been traumatizing, or if they're asking the people experience to engage with participants, and that engagement may lead to re-traumatization. Now, some benefits and challenges cited by the people with lived experience. So benefits were feeling valued and respected if it was done in a way where they were valued. Not always. They felt that there was an opportunity to improve conditions for other people with lived experience. So with their input, the hope was that the research project that was happening or the practice project would benefit the community. And they also, like the experts, cited a two-way learning opportunity. Some of the challenges that they cited was a concern about the ability to take an unbiased view, having had such deep personal experience. They were concerned that they were involved in the development, but then not informed of the results, which made them feel like they weren't really seen as a member of the team. They were just there to ask their opinion. And it wasn't understood by the experts, the researchers, the practitioners that they cared. They were invested in this project. And they also often felt that they had a lack of decision-making power, or they had concerns about the power dynamic. Now, going back to the previous slide about some of the concerns by the experts, they were concerned about sharing power. So we can see that this is a valid concern. And there still needs to be some work there on educating the experts on what is true inclusion in these projects. So now let's talk briefly about some of the potential challenges and important considerations. Some of this I've seen in the literature, but mostly this is just open questions for me that I think are gaps in the literature that I haven't really seen addressed, but are very present for me in my own work, and I think are really important questions that we need to ask. So first, are people with lived experience expected to just there to share their own experience? And if the latter, how do we determine whether or not that informs decision-making for the whole? So for example, if you have a person with autism, or even a few people with autism on your committee or part of the project as people with lived experience, well, we all know the saying, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, right? The experiences are vastly different. And so if that's the case, if one person is there to share their personal experience, how can we say that that should inform how we're going to make decisions for the community at large? And if that's not the case, then how do we get over that hurdle? How do we include people with lived experience, but also make sure that then the decisions that we're making are going to benefit the community? And how many people with lived experience are enough to ensure representation? Do we need 5 people? Do we need 10? Do we need 50? And if we are seeking out the opinions of that many people, at what point is it just research? And a big question for me, because I do research and programs with people with severe or profound disabilities, how do we include them? How do we hear their voices? Too often, we're only hearing the voices of people who can comprehend what's happening and communicate how they feel. How do we make sure that we're understanding the experience of people who maybe can't comprehend the questions that would be part of this process and can't really communicate how they feel, or might not even be able to completely understand how they feel, but they're our target community? There are some tools out there, but they're not really complete, and they're not being implemented enough by project leaders. This is a really, really important gap that needs to be addressed. People that can communicate and comprehend are having a vastly different experience than people with severe or profound disabilities. And finally, I'm just going to share my perspective as a person with lived experience and an expert. I really feel that my personal experience is just that. And I would not feel comfortable with somebody seeing my personal experience as representing other people in my community, either neurodivergent people as a whole, which is a huge community with a lot of variation, or even people with the same diagnoses that I have. I'm very aware that my experience is not the experience of others. However, my expertise comes from deep diving into the experiences of many people with different experiences through my own research, through reviewing loads of literature, and in thousands of hours working with hundreds of people with different disabilities in my work at Lotus Center. So just to say that the expertise is important too, and can contribute a lot of varied experience, varied viewpoints, and the personal experience is important personal experience as well. How can we bring the two together so that they are informing each other? And I will say, for me, it's really difficult to separate my own experience from being an expert. I know I said at the beginning that I feel like they're separate, but how separate are they? I've always been this person and approached my work as a neurodivergent person. I feel like they're separate, but it's always informing the work that I do. How much is the fact that I share the condition of being disabled creating a connection that has maybe allowed me a deeper understanding than if I wasn't disabled? My point here is that I think that research on neurodivergent or disabled experts would actually be a really valuable addition to this landscape and inform the conversation. What does it mean to be both? How can we better understand the roles of both without any sort of conflict of people feeling, offended or that they're not being taken seriously? All of that to say, there's still a lot of work to do in this area. And these are just here to start a conversation. With that said, I would love to continue the conversation. So please feel free to email me and let me know your thoughts. I'm also sharing the websites for Lotus Center and for the Lotus Institute for Professional Development. Thank